My name is Ava Parker. I'm 24 years old and I live in a modest apartment located in the heart of the city. I don't quite know how to describe myself. Perhaps just ordinary. I work at a graphic design firm, and on weekends I find myself watching reruns of old TV shows, often wondering if this is all life truly has to offer. It doesn't sound all that inspiring, does it? But if there's one thing that stands out about me, it's my strained relationship with my mother, Claire Parker, or more accurately, the absence of one. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end and like the video, because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. Claire has always been more concerned with herself than with anyone else. She's stunning, full of life, and magnetic, the type of woman who enters a room and commands everyone's attention. Growing up, I admired her. I wanted to be like her. But as I got older, my admiration began to turn into resentment as I realized how little she truly cared about anyone but herself. It's hard to avoid sounding bitter, but that's the reality. Claire wasn't the kind of mother who packed school lunches or inquired about your day. She was the one who threw lavish parties and overlooked your birthday. She moved from one relationship to another as quickly as she changed her clothes, always chasing the next man who could provide her with the attention she craved. That's how Thomas entered our lives. I was 16 when Claire married him. He was her fourth husband, a calm, grounding influence in the storm that was her world. At first, I didn't know what to make of him. He was quiet but self-assured, kind yet distant. He wasn't like the others, flashy, boastful, or trying to impress anyone. He was steady, dependable, and for a teenager who had witnessed her mother's chaotic love life, that was a refreshing change. Thomas treated me with a respect I wasn't accustomed to. He took an interest in my passions, encouraged me to pursue my dreams, and even stood up to Claire when she dismissed my ambitions. He became the father figure I had always wanted, and for the first time I felt that someone genuinely cared about me. As I grew older, however, my feelings for Thomas began to change. It wasn't immediate, nor did I even notice it at first, but looking back, I realized when admiration slowly shifted into something deeper. The way he smiled at me across the dinner table, how his hand would stay on my shoulder for just a moment too long, and how his eyes softened when he looked at me. I told myself it meant nothing. He was my stepfather after all, and he loved Claire. But the truth was, Claire didn't deserve him. She took him for granted, just like she did everything else. Then came the betrayal that turned everything upside down. Ethan was my boyfriend of 3 years. We'd met in college, fell in love, and planned our future together, or so I thought. When I found out he had been cheating on me, it felt like my world had fallen apart. I spent days lying in bed, crying, questioning what I had done wrong. But as the pain started to fade, it was replaced by something else. Anger. Not just at Ethan, but at my mother. Claire had always been quick to criticize me, to point out my shortcomings, and to compare me to herself. She had a way of making me feel inadequate, as though I could never live up to her. And now, sitting alone in my tiny apartment, nursing a broken heart, I realized I was done letting her win. I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew where I wanted to be. I texted Claire telling her I'd be coming over for dinner. She was thrilled, of course, not because she genuinely missed me, but because she loved being the perfect hostess. When I arrived at the house, it felt like I had stepped into another world. The elegant decor, the polished floors, the subtle scent of lavender. It was everything my apartment wasn't. But the most striking part was Thomas. He greeted me with warmth, his smile reaching his eyes in a way that made my chest tighten. Claire was already busy in the kitchen, distracted by her latest project, and Thomas and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The silence between us was comfortable but filled with an unspoken charge. As the evening progressed, I couldn't help but notice the way Thomas looked at me. It wasn't inappropriate, but it wasn't indifferent either. There was a tenderness, a quiet intensity that made my heart race. What started innocently, a touch on the arm, a lingering glance, a shared laugh, grew into something more with every passing moment. I found myself drawn to him in a way that confused and unsettled me. The turning point came one evening when Claire went to bed early, leaving Thomas and me alone. We sat together on the couch, the warm glow from the fireplace casting shadows across the room. I don't remember what we were talking about, probably something trivial, but I do remember the way he looked at me. It was as though he saw through me, past all the anger, past the walls I had built around myself. His gaze was steady and unflinching, making me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt in years. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand on his. He didn't pull away. The kiss was slow, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. His lips were warm, his touch gentle, and for a moment the rest of the world faded away. The kiss lingered in my thoughts long after it had ended. It felt like a fire had been sparked inside me, chasing away the pain and rejection that had consumed me for weeks. But it wasn't just the kiss itself. It was the way Thomas looked at me afterward. There was no hesitation, no judgment, just a quiet intensity that made my pulse quicken. I pulled back slightly, my breath unsteady as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. His hand was still on mine, warm and solid. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room, a backdrop to the overwhelming emotions between us. I should have felt guilt. I should have been consumed with shame or fear, but instead all I felt was a strange sense of belonging, as though this was exactly where I was supposed to be. Thomas's thumb brushed across the back of my hand, a small, tender gesture that sent shivers up my spine. I looked up at him, searching his eyes for reassurance, for some indication that this wasn't a mistake. And then, without a word, he leaned in again. This kiss was different. It wasn't hesitant or uncertain, but deliberate, filled with a passion that left me breathless. His hands moved to my face, firm yet gentle, and I melted into him, allowing the moment to wash over me. When we finally parted, my head was spinning. My mind screamed for me to say something, to acknowledge what had just happened, but the words seemed inadequate. Instead, I rested my forehead against his, my eyes closing as I tried to catch my breath. I opened my mouth, but he silenced me with a soft shake of his head. His hand slid down to my shoulder, and I felt a warmth spreading through me that I hadn't felt in years. It was a deep connection, a sense of being truly seen and valued in a way I hadn't realized I had been missing. The next morning, I woke up to a storm of emotions inside me. Part of me wanted to stay in that moment forever, to remain in the safety and warmth of Thomas's arms. But another part of me was terrified. What had I done? What did this mean for us, for me, for him, and for my mother? I avoided Claire that day, making excuses to retreat to my apartment. But the truth was, I couldn't face her. Not yet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Thomas's face, felt the heat of his kiss, and my heart ached with the weight of what we had started. Thomas texted me later that evening with a simple message asking if I was okay. It was a small gesture, but it made my chest tighten. He cared. He always had, and now that care had grown into something I couldn't ignore. The following days were a blur of stolen glances and fleeting touches. I found excuses to visit the house when Claire wasn't around. Every time we were alone, the tension between us grew, a subtle thread pulling us closer. One evening, after Claire had gone to bed early, I found myself sitting on the back porch with Thomas. The air was cool, the scent of freshly cut grass mingling with the soft smell of the wine we had been drinking. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and familiar. I leaned against him, resting my head on his shoulder, and for a moment, it felt as though the rest of the world didn't exist. What we shared was intoxicating and yet fragile. We were cautious, aware of the lines we were crossing, but no matter how much we tried to deny it, our connection only grew stronger. One night, as a summer storm raged outside, I found myself standing in the kitchen with Thomas. The lights flickered briefly, the thunder rumbled in the distance, and for a moment, the tension between us was nearly unbearable. He moved closer, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for the counter. I turned to face him, my breath catching in my throat as our eyes locked. Without thinking, I closed the gap between us, my lips finding his in a kiss that was desperate yet tender. The rain beat against the windows, a rhythmic sound that accompanied the passion that unfolded between us. His arms enveloped me, pulling me close as the world outside disappeared. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Claire, the consequences, the uncertainty of the future, all that mattered was the way he made me feel. Wanted, cherished, and alive. And as the weeks passed, our relationship deepened. We found ways to steal moments, each encounter filled with passion and vulnerability. Thomas became my sanctuary, my escape from the chaos of my life. But with every stolen kiss and whispered word, the weight of our actions grew heavier. I began to notice the cracks in our carefully constructed facade. Though Claire remained oblivious, I knew it was only a matter of time before she found out. Despite the growing risks, I couldn't let go. Thomas was more than just a lover. He was my anchor. He made me feel whole in a way I had never experienced before. The weeks following that kiss during the storm were a blur of longing and stolen moments. Each encounter with Thomas became more charged and desperate than the last. I would wake up in the middle of the night, replaying every touch, every whispered word, wondering how we had gotten to this point. It wasn't just physical. Thomas understood me in a way no one else ever had. He listened when I spoke about my dreams, my fears, and the pain of growing up under Claire's shadow. He saw me, not as Claire's daughter, not as someone broken by heartache, but as me. That kind of understanding was intoxicating. It made me feel alive, wanted, cherished in a way I had never felt before, but it was also terrifying. Every time we were together, I could feel the weight of the risks we were taking. The line between right and wrong was fragile. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet, I found myself alone with Thomas in the garden. Claire had gone out to meet friends, leaving the house in an eerie silence. Thomas was tending to the roses Claire loved but never cared for. I watched him from the patio, noticing how his hands moved with practiced ease, the lines of his face softened by the fading light. Without knowing why, I found myself walking toward him, my heart racing. He looked up as I approached. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes that made my breath catch. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his, and in that moment, the world seemed to slow. He set down the shears he had been holding, his gaze never leaving mine. For a moment, we simply stood there, the silence between us filled with a tension that was both thrilling and unbearable. Then he reached for me, his hands resting gently on my waist as he pulled me closer. His lips found mine in a slow, deliberate kiss, each movement filled with a tenderness that made my knees weaken. The garden around us faded away, the scent of roses mingling with the warmth of his touch. It felt as though the world had disappeared, leaving just the two of us. We didn't talk about what was happening. Not really. There were no labels, no plans, no promises, but there was an understanding between us, a silent agreement that whatever this was, it was ours. I began to treasure our moments together, the times when we could let our guards down and simply be, whether it was a brief touch as we passed each other in the hallway or a stolen kiss in the quiet of the night. Every interaction felt charged, electric, as if we were breaking every rule. But as our bond deepened, so did the danger. I started to notice the small things. Claire's curious glances, her offhand comments about how much time Thomas and I were spending together. She didn't know, of course, but a part of me wondered if she suspected something. One afternoon, I was sitting in the living room sketching designs for work when Claire walked in. Her eyes scanned me with an intensity that made me uneasy. "You've been coming over a lot lately," she said casually, but with an edge. I shrugged, keeping my gaze focused on my sketchbook. "It's nice to get out of my apartment," I said nonchalantly. She didn't say anything else, but the look she gave me stayed with me long after she left. It was inevitable that our secret would eventually be discovered. Claire was too self-absorbed to notice all the signs, but she wasn't blind. One evening, as I was leaving the house, Thomas walked me to the door. Claire had gone upstairs to get ready for one of her events, and the house was quiet, the only sound the hum of the air conditioner. Thomas leaned in, his hand brushing against mine in a way that sent shivers down my spine. "Drive safe," he murmured softly. I nodded, my heart racing as I stepped outside. But when I turned to close the door behind me, I caught a glimpse of Claire standing at the top of the stairs, her expression unreadable. The days that followed were tense, filled with an unspoken weight that hung heavily in the air. Claire didn't confront me directly, but I could feel her watching me, waiting for me to slip up. Thomas and I became more cautious, but the bond between us was impossible to hide. And then, one night, everything came crashing down. "Do you think I don't see what's going on?" Claire's voice was sharp as she pulled me into the living room. Her eyes burned with an anger I had never seen before. She didn't need to say much. I knew she had figured it out. "You think I'm blind," she spat, venom dripping from her voice. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. What could I say? That I hadn't planned for this? That I had fallen in love with the one person Claire had taken for granted? Thomas stepped into the room, his presence a calming influence amidst the chaos. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at me, the quiet determination in his eyes, was enough to steady me. "This isn't about you," I said finally, my voice trembling but firm. "It's about us." Claire laughed bitterly, the sound cold and harsh. "Us?" she repeated, incredulity in her voice. "You think there's an us?" But there was. I knew it in my heart, and Thomas knew it too. The fallout was as messy as I had imagined it would be. Claire threw me out of the house, her words cruel and biting, but as I packed my things and left, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. Thomas and I didn't have all the answers, and the path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was making my own choices. No matter how difficult or unconventional the road ahead was, I knew one thing for sure. Thomas and I would face it together.